On a Tuesday morning in March of 1981, inside a small office at Hargrove County First Agricultural Bank in eastern Tennessee, Raymond Stills sat across from his agricultural consultant and reviewed a list of land the bank had taken from men who could no longer hold on to it. They went through the properties one by one, slowly and without emotion, because by that point there was nothing unusual about it anymore, just numbers on paper and acres that used to belong to someone else. Most of the listings had movement, a few buyers asking questions, a couple already in negotiation, land that still had some kind of future attached to it. Then they reached the 200 acres on Drummond Road. Stills had barely finished reading the address before the consultant shook his head, the kind of quiet, immediate reaction that came from certainty, not hesitation. "That field is finished," the consultant said, leaning back slightly as if there was nothing more to consider. "Rocky subsoil, pH too low for anything commercial, drainage issues on the north slope. We've had it 4 years and nobody has made a serious offer." Stills looked down at the file again, scanning details he already understood, then closed it with a slow, deliberate motion. "What do we do with it?" he asked. The consultant didn't take time to think about it. "Offer it for whatever we can get," he said. "Clear it off the books. It's costing more in taxes than it's worth." Stills nodded once and wrote a number beside the listing. $400. By the time the notice was typed and posted that afternoon, the bank believed the problem was settled. Just another piece of land they would finally be rid of, just another line cleared from a ledger that had been growing for 3 years. What they didn't know was that someone had been waiting for exactly this kind of land. The next morning, Cecil Drummond was the first person to call, and before we go any further, take a second to do something that will not cost you anything, because if you stay with stories like this all the way to the end, you are exactly who this channel is built for, so subscribe now, and then pay attention to what happens next, because this decision did not start that morning, it started long before anyone else noticed. Cecil lost his farm in November of 1979, and he lost it at a time when there was nothing left to recover it with. It hadn't been one mistake or one bad decision that took it from him, but a chain of things that lined up at the worst possible moment, 2 drought seasons that cut his yields down to almost nothing, a variable rate loan he had taken in 1976 when rates were low, and a bank that adjusted those rates upward until the payments no longer matched what the land could produce. He had farmed that ground for 31 years, the same ground his father had worked before him, and when the notice came, there was no argument left to make, no way to stretch time any further. He packed what he could into his truck on a cold morning and drove away without looking back, because he knew if he turned around even once, he would not be able to leave, and leaving was the only option he had left. For the next 2 years, he worked on other men's farms across the county, doing the same work he had always done, just not on land that belonged to him. He didn't talk about what had happened, and no one asked him to, because in a place like that, everyone already knew, and the kind of loss he carried wasn't something you discussed out loud. But he never stopped thinking about land. At night, in a small rented house that still didn't feel like his, he would sit at the kitchen table with a single light over his shoulder and read whatever he could get his hands on, extension bulletins, university studies, research papers that most men in the county never bothered with because they were busy working the land they already had. Cecil didn't have land anymore, so he studied it instead. He read about soil composition, about drainage systems, about crop varieties that were still being tested, about changes most people hadn't noticed yet because they weren't looking for them. And slowly, without telling anyone, he began to understand something that wasn't obvious to anyone else. Not every piece of bad land was actually bad. Some of it was just being measured the wrong way. When the listing for the 200 acres appeared, Cecil recognized the location immediately. Drummond Road. He had walked that ground as a boy, long before anyone had written reports about it, long before anyone had declared it unusable, back when it was just another stretch of land that hadn't been figured out yet. He could see it clearly without driving out there, the slope on the north side where water settled, the rocky sections that made plowing difficult, the uneven soil that had never responded the way people expected it to. He also knew something else, something the bank's consultant had written off without realizing it. Cecil had been reading for 2 years, and somewhere in that time he had come across something that changed the way he looked at land like that. He didn't explain it to anyone. He didn't mention it at the feed store or at the farms where he worked, or even to the men who still remembered when that ground used to produce something. He just made the call. By Thursday morning, Cecil Drummond walked into Hargrove County First Agricultural Bank, wearing a clean shirt, his father's old coat, and carrying $400 in a plain envelope. The same bank that had taken his land 2 years earlier. The same building he had walked out of in silence. The same place where his name still existed in a file that said he had lost everything. He stepped inside anyway, and this time he wasn't there to explain why he couldn't pay. He was there to buy. The bank office sounded the same as it always had, quiet in a way that carried every small movement, with the soft turning of paper, the low hum of a ceiling fan, and the faint creak of shoes on the polished floor, all blending into a steady background that never changed, and Cecil noticed all of it as he stepped inside, because this was not a place a man forgot. Raymond Stills received him with the same professional calm he showed everyone, a man who believed in order and process, and who had built his reputation on the idea that if you followed the numbers long enough, they would eventually lead you to the right answer. So when he motioned toward the chair across from his desk, there was nothing unusual in the gesture, even though the moment itself carried more weight than either of them acknowledged. "Mr. Drummond," he said, and Cecil sat down without hesitation, placing the envelope on the desk between them without pushing it forward, as if the decision had already been made long before he walked through the door. Stills opened the file and reviewed the listing carefully, confirming the parcel and the details one by one, and when everything matched, he gave a small nod before pausing, because something about the situation required a second look, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. "Mr. Drummond," he said again, lifting his eyes over his glasses, "you understand what you're purchasing?" Cecil met his gaze without shifting. "I do." Stills turned a page and read directly from the consultant's report, not rushing through the words and not emphasizing them either, just laying them out plainly the way they had been written, as if the facts alone were enough to settle the matter. Rocky subsoil, low pH, drainage issues on the north slope, unsuitable for commercial crop production. He closed the file and rested his hand on top of it, keeping his voice steady and even. "I want to make sure you're going into this with full information," he said, and there was no edge in it, no attempt to discourage. Just a man doing what he believed was the right thing. "I appreciate that," Cecil replied. The pause that followed lasted just a little longer than normal conversation allowed, because both men understood that the decision sitting between them was not a small one, even if it only cost $400. Stills leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more direct without becoming harsh. "Mr. Drummond, the bank acquired this property in 1977, and we've had it listed for 4 years without a single serious buyer. And our own consultant has determined that it cannot support a viable crop." He let that settle before asking the question that mattered. "Are you certain about this?" Cecil picked up the envelope and slid it across the desk in one smooth motion. "I am." he said. Stills looked down at the envelope, then back at Cecil, and for a brief moment there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not doubt, exactly, but curiosity, because men did not usually walk into a bank to buy land that everyone else had already decided was worthless. Then he processed the sale. The papers were signed, the receipt was written, and just like that, 200 acres that no one wanted belonged to a man who had spent the last 2 years working land that wasn't his. And the simplicity of the transaction made the weight of it even harder to measure. As Cecil stood to leave, the office door opened and one of the loan officers stepped in, a man who recognized him immediately because he had been there 2 years earlier, when Cecil sat in that same building for a very different reason, and for a moment the two men looked at each other in silence, the loan officer giving a small nod that Cecil returned without speaking, because there was nothing either of them needed to say. Then Cecil walked out. In a county like that, news did not spread slowly, and by the time the afternoon settled in, men at the feed store were already talking about it, standing near the counter with coffee cups in their hands as the story moved from one voice to another, each person adding the same details until they became fixed. Cecil Drummond bought that bank field, the one on Drummond Road. Paid $400 for it. A man near the back shook his head slowly and said it was $400 more than it was worth, and no one challenged him because everyone there had seen that land and believed they understood it. At the diner that evening, the conversation carried the same tone, not loud and not cruel, but steady in its doubt, the kind of doubt that comes from experience rather than opinion, and a farmer who had lost his own place not long after Cecil sat at the counter staring into his coffee, before saying quietly that he hoped Cecil knew what he was doing, and when no one answered him, it was not because they disagreed, but because they didn't. Late that same afternoon, a truck pulled up along the edge of the 200 acres, and a man stepped out and walked to the fence line, resting his hands on the top wire as he looked out across the land. And this was the same man who had bought Cecil's equipment at the foreclosure auction in 1979, the same man who had stood there before when everything Cecil owned was being sold piece by piece, and now he stood there again looking at ground that everyone had already given up on, and after a few minutes he turned without saying a word and drove away, not stopping anywhere to talk about it because there was nothing he could add that hadn't already been said. That evening, Cecil sat at the kitchen table in his rented house with his nephew across from him, and the table looked the same as it had for the past 2 years, worn at the edges, a single light overhead, the kind of place where quiet decisions were made without anyone noticing. His nephew had come as soon as he heard what Cecil had done, not because he understood it, but because he trusted him enough to know there had to be a reason behind it. Cecil reached into his coat and pulled out a folded bulletin, worn from being handled too many times, and laid it flat on the table. "Read that," he said. His nephew picked it up and began scanning the page, his eyes moving slowly as he tried to make sense of it. "This is from the university," he said. "University of Tennessee," Cecil replied. His nephew looked up. "What am I looking for?" Cecil leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table as he watched him. "They tested that land against the wrong crop," he said. His nephew frowned. "What do you mean?" Cecil tapped the paper once with his finger. "Standard burley tobacco needs low acidity and clean drainage, and that ground doesn't give you either one, so they tested it, wrote it off, and moved on." His nephew glanced back down at the bulletin. "This says something different," he said. "It does," Cecil answered. "New hybrid, higher acid tolerance, stronger root system, handles rocky ground better than clean soil." There was a pause as his nephew read further, slower now. "They just released this last year." "80," Cecil said. "I found it 8 months ago." His nephew looked up again, holding the thought longer this time. "You've been waiting." Cecil reached forward, folded the bulletin carefully, and placed it back into his notebook. "I've been looking," he said quietly, "and waiting came after." His nephew sat back, still trying to measure what that meant. "You're sure about this?" Cecil nodded once. "I am." And in that moment, the question that had been moving through the county all day shifted without anyone else realizing it, because it was no longer about whether the land was worthless, but about whether anyone else had understood it the way he did. Spring of 1981 did not arrive all at once, and when the ground finally softened enough to begin working, Cecil stepped onto the 200 acres early in the morning before anyone else arrived, not because there was work he could not do later, but because he wanted to see the land when it was quiet, before tools touched it, before anything changed, so he could understand exactly what he had committed himself to. The field did not look like something a man would choose. It stretched unevenly across the hills, with patches of exposed rock breaking through the surface and sections of soil that held a dull, heavy color that told its own story without needing explanation. And as Cecil walked slowly across it, he was not looking for what was wrong, because he already knew that, but for what was still possible. He stopped once near the center of the field and bent down, picking up a handful of soil and letting it fall back through his fingers, watching the way it broke apart, the way it held together, measuring something that could not be written in a report. Then he stood up and looked across the land again. Not at what it had been called, but at what it could become. The first attempt to work the ground did not go well. The borrowed tractor struggled almost immediately, the blade catching against rock that sat just beneath the surface, forcing the machine to jolt and pull in a way that made it clear this was not land that would respond easily, and after only a short stretch, Cecil stopped. Not because the work was finished, but because pushing forward the same way would not work. The men working with him waited, expecting him to adjust and continue, but instead he shut the machine down and stepped off, walking the section slowly, studying it again as if the problem had changed since the first pass. He had seen this before, not here, but in what he had read. He adjusted the approach, changed the depth, changed the angle, started again. This time, the blade moved differently, not smoothly, but steadily enough to continue, and the progress that followed was not fast, but it was real. And over the course of that day, the field began to open in small sections, each one requiring its own adjustment, its own patience, its own understanding. The work stretched into days, then into weeks, and the field refused to become consistent, which meant that every part of it demanded attention, and there were no moments where the work could simply be pushed through and completed, because each section presented a slightly different version of the same problem. On some days, progress could be measured. On others, it felt like nothing had changed at all. And that was where doubt began to settle in. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, in the space between effort and result. The north slope became its own problem. Water had always settled there, and even before they began, Cecil knew that if that part of the field failed, everything else would follow it, because water does not stay where you want it to unless you give it somewhere else to go. So they began cutting the channel, by hand. The ground there was harder than expected, not because it was solid, but because it shifted, forcing them to adjust their footing as they worked, and the trench moved forward slowly, one section at a time, each foot gained through effort that did not look like much from a distance, but felt heavier with every hour. By the end of the first week, the channel was only halfway done. By the end of the second week, it was complete. But even then, there was no guarantee it would work. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Cecil stood alone on that slope again, shovel in hand, looking down the length of the channel they had cut, and for a moment the stillness around him brought something else back with it, the memory of standing in a different place 2 years earlier, looking at land he was about to lose, knowing there was nothing left he could do to stop it. That memory did not speak. It did not need to. It was already part of him. Then he stepped forward, placed the shovel into the ground, and kept working. Planting came in May. The seed cost more than he had left to spend comfortably, and when he paid for it, there was nothing behind that decision. No safety, no backup, just the understanding that this was everything. And once it went into the ground, it would either work or it would not. They planted carefully, not rushing rows, not skipping steps, because Cecil knew that mistakes would not show themselves immediately, but they would appear later, when there was nothing left to fix them. And when the last row was finished, the work changed, because there was nothing left to do, except wait. Waiting did not come easy. Days passed without visible change, and the field remained quiet in a way that made time feel slower, because when everything depends on what has not happened yet, every day carries more weight than it should. Then the first signs of growth appeared. At first, they were uneven. Some sections came up strong, others did not, and for several days there was a tension that none of the men spoke about directly, but all of them felt, because what they were seeing did not match what they were used to. One of the men finally said it, pointing out that the field was not coming up the way it should. And when Cecil looked across the rows, he could see exactly what they were seeing: the uneven growth, the sections that were slower to respond, the parts that did not match what they were used to. But he also saw something else beneath it, a pattern forming that aligned with what he had expected from the beginning, and instead of explaining it, he simply said that it would come together and left it at that, because what he was waiting for had not fully revealed itself yet. Then the rain came, not the kind that helps a crop settle, but the kind that lingers longer than it should and tests everything that has been built. And for 2 days it settled into the north slope, pushing water into the exact place that could undo weeks of work. And during that time, there was nothing left to do but watch, to wait, and to measure whether the channel they had cut would hold under pressure that it had not yet faced. Cecil walked the slope alone that morning, moving slowly along the trench, watching the way the water moved through it, noticing where it held, where it pushed, and where it came close to failing. And for a moment it felt like everything might shift just enough to break the system they had built. But it didn't, because the channel held. Not perfectly, but well enough to carry the water through without letting it settle where it could cause damage. When the rain passed and the ground began to settle again, the field started to change in a way that could no longer be ignored as the uneven growth began to fill in, slowly at first and then more steadily until the difference between the weaker sections and the stronger ones began to close. And by early June, there was a visible shift across the land, with the plants holding firm, the roots pushing deeper, and the ground that had been written off beginning to respond in a way that no one had expected. By the time July arrived, the question was no longer whether the crop would grow, because that had already been answered, and what remained was something else entirely: how far it would go. By October of 1981, the 200 acres no longer looked like the field the bank had been trying to sell for 4 years, and anyone who drove past it could see that something had happened there that did not match what they thought they knew, because the plants stood taller than expected. The leaves were heavier, and the rows had filled in with a consistency that should not have been possible on ground that had been written off as finished. And the difference was not subtle enough to ignore, which meant that people who had dismissed the decision in the spring were now slowing their trucks along the road without meaning to, trying to understand what they were looking at. The extension agent who had visited in July returned again, this time walking the field more slowly and with more attention, stopping at different sections, pulling leaves, checking the soil, and writing notes that he would later include in a report that described the result as remarkable for any soil type, and especially for land that had previously been classified as non-viable. When the buyer came up from Knoxville to inspect the crop, he did not rush the visit, and after walking the field once, he turned and walked it again, which was not something he did unless the numbers in his head did not match what he was seeing in front of him, and when he finally made his offer, he did it carefully, measuring his words the same way he had measured the field, and the number he gave was higher than Cecil expected, and when everything was written down and confirmed, the result was not just good, it was enough. Cecil sat in his truck after the buyer left, the engine off and the door still closed, with the field stretched out in front of him in a way that felt different now. Not because it had changed in that moment, but because what it meant had changed. And he reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope, and flattened it against the steering wheel before taking out a pen, writing the numbers slowly and carefully to make sure each one was right, then stopping to look at them without reacting, allowing the weight of it to settle in without interruption. Then he did it again, not because he had made a mistake, but because he needed to be certain. And when he finished the second time, he leaned back slightly and looked out across the land, understanding in that moment that what had happened was not just that the crop had worked, but that it had given him something he had not had since 1979, which was a way back. In November of 1981, Cecil Drummond walked back into Hargrove County First Agricultural Bank, and the building had not changed, with the same quiet air, the same steady rhythm of work behind desks, and the same sense of order that made everything feel controlled and predictable, and when he asked to see Raymond Stills, he was received the same way he had been before, with a gesture toward the same chair. And for a moment the scene looked almost identical to what it had been 8 months earlier, except for one detail that changed everything, because this time he was not there to buy land no one wanted, he was there to take something back. He sat down and placed an envelope on the desk, larger than the one he had brought before, resting his hand on it briefly before sliding it forward, as he said he wanted to discuss the Drummond Road parcel, and Stills opened the file, reviewed the details, and named the price for the 40 acres that had once belonged to Cecil's family, the same land the bank had taken in 1979 and held since then, and Cecil nodded once before sliding the envelope across. And when Stills opened it and counted the money carefully, he looked up and confirmed what he was seeing, and Cecil confirmed it just as simply. There was a pause that lasted longer than the one that had happened months earlier, because this time there was no uncertainty in what the moment meant, and as Stills looked down at the file and then back at Cecil, he spoke again, referencing the 200 acres and the fact that it had only taken one season, and there was something in his voice now that carried both disbelief and recognition at the same time, and when he repeated what the consultant had said about the field being finished, Cecil answered calmly that he had read the report, and when Stills asked what he knew that the consultant did not, Cecil reached into his jacket and placed the folded University of Tennessee bulletin on the desk, the same one he had carried with him quietly for months. Stills picked it up, looked at the date, and realized when it had been published, and when he said that Cecil had been planning this, there was no denial, because none was needed, and after setting the bulletin down, he returned to the paperwork and processed the sale with the same precision he had always used, even though the meaning behind the transaction had completely changed. As Cecil stood to leave, Stills spoke again, this time more quietly, saying that he was glad it had worked out, and Cecil put on his coat and answered without raising his voice, stating simply that it had worked out because he knew what he was doing, and then He walked out without waiting for anything more. By 1985, Cecil had rebuilt what he lost and more, expanding his operation to 280 acres, all of it owned outright without debt, and worked with the same attention that had carried him through the years when he had nothing, and when the University of Tennessee Extension Office invited him to speak at their agricultural conference in 1983, he almost declined because speaking was never something he had needed to do. But after being convinced to go, he stood in front of the room and spoke for 12 minutes, explaining only what mattered, and then answered questions for 45 minutes, because the men listening understood that what he had done was not luck. It was knowledge applied at the right moment, and 3 farmers in that room, who had similar land, planted it the following season. Raymond Stills retired from the bank in 1989, and at his retirement dinner, he told the story of the $400 field, describing it as the clearest lesson of his career, not about failure, but about the difference between what a test measures and what a man knows. Cecil Drummond died in 2001, quietly and without attention, the same way he had lived, and the land he rebuilt remained in his family, worked by his son, carrying forward something that had nearly been lost. And the 200 acres he bought for $400 is now valued at over $800,000, while the bank that sold it closed in 1994. The bank was not wrong with the information it had, and the consultant was not careless in his judgment, because they tested the land against what they understood and reached a conclusion that made sense based on what they knew. But Cecil had spent 2 years reading everything he could find while working land that did not belong to him, preparing for an opportunity he could not yet see, learning quietly without recognition and without any guarantee that what he was learning would ever matter. And when the listing appeared, he recognized it immediately, not because he was lucky, but because he was ready. And the difference between those two things is the difference between waiting for something to happen and being prepared when it does. And maybe that is the part most people miss, because it wasn't luck, and it wasn't timing, and it wasn't something that just happened to him. It was preparation that nobody saw, and a decision he made when there was no proof it would work. And that is something most people never get credit for, because by the time the result shows up, the work behind it is already invisible. And if you've ever had a moment like that in your own life, where you saw something others didn't, or believed in something people told you wasn't worth it, then you already understand this story better than most. Take a second to subscribe, not because you have to, but because this channel is built for people who recognize stories like this when they hear them. And if this one stayed with you, then the next one probably will too. And if there is something in your life that people dismissed, something they said would never work, but you saw it differently, then tell that story in the comments, because those are the ones worth hearing. And if you're listening from somewhere far from Tennessee, let me know where you're watching from too, because it's always interesting to see how far stories like this travel.